using the sense of necessity that they are invoking here. Is there even a sense of necessity? Is there a coherent space for this modality? I have no idea. I mean, I've thought about this for a long time, and I can't find a space for it. So I think there's something they want and probably can't have. As far as the second question of whether or not this provides a buffer with respect to God's responsibility for evil, I think the answer to that question depends on the answer to the first question. I mean, if there really is a coherent slice of logical space here that they can occupy, maybe there is. But again, I think the view's incoherent, so I don't know how to answer that question. Well, maybe it's because I'm expecting more for the view on Leibniz's behalf than he expects for it, and the same thing with respect to these other two. So that could be my problem. Yeah.
I mean, just jumping in on this as a more sympathetic response, or response on behalf of Mike's reading, why can't it be the case that the very involvement of final causation as being the determining factor itself is what provides the kind of buffer and that's what Leibniz was thinking, that if you didn't have that buffer, then it'd be hopeless. But because that type of causation is involved, but that wasn't the question. I was actually intrigued by the interchange between Mike and Lloyd because, and especially Mike's response, because I thought that the way that Lloyd was setting up his summary sort of left out a critical element that I think Mike was emphasizing in the moral necessitarian tradition that was important to Leibniz, namely that the moral necessitarians are introducing something over and above the availability of various options in denying the first premise of the moral necessitarian, the necessitarian argument. So as you ended your paper, you said on the top of 29, once we adopt this framework, the possible in its own nature account of free choice begins to make a bit more sense. And it's precisely, I took it, that by having this notion of being morally necessitated but not metaphysically necessitated, you can make more sense of the possible in its own nature account, while the way that Lloyd was presenting it, moral necessitarianism basically was part and parcel with the availability of other possible options. And it didn't add anything to that. And I take it, the evidence of his adopting moral necessitarianism in your way emerges in all the earlier writings, but I took it that the Theodician writings might have something more in it. So if you could address that.
Right. So the idea was, when I said it makes more sense, I didn't mean to imply that at a certain point Leibniz makes this discovery and then he's got a new philosophical tool that for him makes more sense of the cluster of views that he holds. Rather, it's for us, I think, as we look back at his view and we puzzle over this possible in its own nature account, which to me, I mean, maybe I'm idiosyncratic here, but that doesn't seem to do any interesting philosophical work at all, as far as I'm concerned, at least in the context in which Leibniz deploys it. Maybe in conjunction with this other thing, it looks a little bit more interesting. And I think the inclination without necessitation language is present in the past. So I think he is running that in harness in his own mind with the possible in its own nature defense. So the making more sense isn't for Leibniz. It's not as if he discovers this and thinks, now the pieces come together. I think the pieces were already in place for him. It's just that we're blind to that.
Just one quick follow-up. Lloyd, do you agree then that that rich notion of moral necessity is in play in the earlier works as well? Because the way that you formulated it seemed to leave that out, especially the second way in the chart.
Which part are we talking about here?
That chart, the second.
Well, I take these to be the core points that Leibniz wants to make with regard to moral necessity, and I think they're all present early on and late on. It's just late on Leibniz will use terms like moral necessity and so on.
So look at the second sentence of the second formulation. It must be necessarily possible for God to choose not
To create.
or to choose to create less than the best, since there are all
Yeah.
different forces of action. So
He does use that as an explanation even early on.
But is that the critical explanation as to why there is a choice? Or why he can choose something else?
To the best of my knowledge, yes, it is. Mike may be able to shed a bit more light on that, but certainly when I was putting this together, that seemed to be Leibniz's stock response to that. Why is God's choice not necessitated? Because, well, there are other possibilities he could have chosen from.
Yeah, I don't want to commit until I can go back and look more carefully. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, I was fascinated by the exposition of Granado and Ruiz, who I don't know anything about, but I was puzzled, maybe it's just clarificatory, but I was puzzled by your thought that they obviously are offering a new rejection of one in the necessity argument that you started off with, rather than rejecting two, and that was because of the whole discussion of what you called Principle 4 on page 11 and 12 of your paper. This is the principle that moral necessity to the best does not imply that each thing in the universe is as good as it can be considered on its own. They do say in the quotation that you have here things about morally being necessitated to choose the best, but then in your exposition a little bit further on, you say this raises a few difficulties. If moral necessity to the best applies only to God's choice among things as embedded in whole worlds, it seems that moral necessity would apply only to choices among whole worlds, yet they're reluctant to hold that God's choice with respect to this world is morally necessary, which seems like it's out of keeping with some of the other things that are said. But then going on, Ruiz argues that worlds with more substance than our world or a longer duration than our world would be better than our world. Can that be right, simpliciter, that they would be better than our world? Don't we then just lose this world's being the best?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and I don't know the answer. As you can tell from the part of the paper that I read after I quoted those sections, there are different ways of putting together the view. And it may be the case that each of them do put it together in some very clear way in some text that I haven't yet seen, but I don't have that. And in the later tradition there's ambiguity on how they understand this. So you might be right. I mean, I actually hadn't thought of that before, but perhaps two is equally under fire here.
Yeah, I mean, it would be for different reasons than Bob thinks Leibniz challenges
right.
two.
Right. Yep.
But the thought would be, it looks like here's something like things that don't admit of intrinsic maxima. As long as you have a certain amount of duration, it's not going to help that much more to add more time to the history of the world. But it might add a little bit, and so there might be, in some sense, a world that's better. But God might, for whatever reason, not choose that one. Or there might just not be a best, because adding a little bit of duration always does add a little bit of value.
Right. You know, interestingly, I mean, I can't quote the passages from memory, but I'll bet I can provide you with texts from both of them where they deny that there is a best world. And but the reason for that, it has to do with the infinite continuum of increasingly better worlds. It's not because the moral status of a world is contingent. That is, the moral valuation of a world isn't a contingent fact about that world. And I think that, you know, if you think Leibniz, in those cases where people think Leibniz is rejecting two, that's what's at issue. Okay. So the reason for the difference of opinion over two is, interesting. It's not the same.
Yeah, so this goes back to actually a point that Sartre brought up in his question. So there's first the debate you guys had about whether it's really a view that came later or whether the terminology came later. But then there is also the other question whether we're really talking about a different solution to this problem that it looks like God necessarily created this world. And I'm still not sure I see that part. So I don't see how we get really a new solution to the, I don't know what you call it, the theological necessity problem or whatever. Because, I mean, what seems to be doing the work as before, and I think that I'm disagreeing with the point Sartre made, is just a possibility in its own nature thing. That's what you need to deny one. And, that is a condition for something to count as morally necessary. So you first got to rule out that it's metaphysically necessary, and that you do